So every society has to solve a certain set of problems. And these problems are basically universal, right? So you'd be hard pressed to think of a society that doesn't have to figure out how to take care of their sick or injured, or to pass on new knowledge to each successive generation, right? Or how to feed and meet the material needs of its citizens or its members, or to protect themselves from threats or enemies, right? So what do societies do when they need to solve these problems, as each of them faces these? They create institutions. Institutions are the cultural solution to solving these problems. And that is because a society does not want to have to come up with a new novel solution every single time they're faced with what is going to be an endlessly recurring set of problems, right? So people keep getting sick, kids keep getting born, enemies keep threatening. And so rather than having to come up with a brand new solution every time, these habitual aggregated patterns of behavior start to take root. Now, just because the problems that societies face are consistent or universal across societies, the solutions are not. So the kinds of institutions that a society builds to solve those problems can vary greatly. And so we see that, right? So if you look at different countries, and certainly throughout time, there's many different ways that a society has decided to educate the young, right? So here in the U.S., the primary method is the public K through 12 school system. But even then, there's charter schools and there's private schools, there's homeschooling, right? So there's different institutional formulations to meet this basic need. Say take militaries, for example, to protect a nation from threat. How do you have an air force and a navy and an army? Do you just have one large group? We just launched a space force, right? So the formulations, the ways in which the institutions are built can change. And it's often quite fascinating when you do like a comparison across nations of some institutional design, or whether that's around criminal justice and the systems and the way they work, or economic systems, employment. You name the sector, the domain of society, and there's a near endless set of ways in which it could be designed. Now, if you grow up in a certain society that solves their whatever problem we're talking about in a specific way, it may start to become very difficult to think of alternatives, right? So if you grow up and you're socialized, you internalize one basic system, one institutional formulation, that can start to make it seem like the inevitable or most natural or only way to solve that problem, when in fact there's many ways, right? So take marriage, for example. That's a pretty universally used institution for solving the problem of mate selection in the U.S., right? Last I read, I think it's about like 90% of people attempt marriage at some point in their life, right? Is marriage the only way we could solve mate selection? No, certainly not. We could have designed many different institutions, but for a lot of people, it's almost difficult to think of alternatives, right? In addition, the institutions that do exist in a given society, they aren't always perfect, right? So there really is no perfect institutional design. They don't have to be maximally efficient for a society to function. They don't have to be maximally efficient to be sufficient, is another way of saying that. Sociologist Robert Merton, for example, writes about the Hopi rain dance. So this indigenous group, and they would come together and have this rain dance. And the manifest function, the stated purpose of this institution, this regular ceremony, was to bring the rain. Now, did the rain dance actually increase instances of precipitation? Probably not. So it may not have been a very efficient solution to bringing rain, but nevertheless, the rain dance persisted. And his argument was that even though the manifest purpose of this institution was to bring rain, it had a latent function that was still sufficient in solving a problem for the society. So it wasn't really solving the bringing of rain, but what it was solving was the need for the society to regularly come together, build group solidarity, and so that ceremony created that. So it had a purpose. So for one, when an institution exists, And it doesn't seem like it's any longer meeting, or maybe never has met its primary stated purpose. If it continues to exist, it means it's still solving some function in that society. It's still solving some problem that society needs solved. But due to something called path dependence, it may not always be the most maximally efficient solution, right? Path dependence is where it's basically the inertia. Once a institution is built, and it becomes the status quo, there's a lot of vested interest in keeping it in place, right? And so an example might be the QWERTY keyboard, right? We have more efficient keyboard layouts. But once you've learned to type on a QWERTY keyboard, you're not going to go relearn on something else. And so even though we have more efficient designs for keyboards, there's not a lot of interest in changing the keyboard structure. Well, take that and apply it to something else, marriage, or the way the military runs, or the way our educational system or political system, so on and so forth, runs, right? Path dependence causes us to lock into the institutions that have been deeply ingrained in a society, whether or not they're maximally efficient, and whether or not they're solving the manifest or primary stated need that a society has when they built it. They may very well be solving a latent problem.